Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Robert Doar, the president of AEI, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this event where we will reflect on the 50th anniversary of the House Judiciary Committee's vote recommending the impeachment of Richard Nixon. Today's event is the latest in AEI's long-standing effort to learn from our nation's past through a commitment to serious scholarship, reflection, and public engagement. The task of renewing our nation's core institutions is more urgent now than ever these days, and impossible to accomplish without an honest understanding of the forces, values, events, and individuals that have shaped our country for more than 250 years. So I'm proud and honored today that we are joined by two panels of distinguished guests to better understand the events of 1974 and their lessons for the present. Now, our first panel will focus on the House Judiciary Committee by bringing together scholars with veterans of the inquiry. And we are very pleased to have with us today former Defense Secretary and former United States Senator William Cohen, who as a young representative from Maine was one of 7 Republicans on the committee to vote in favor of impeachment. We are also joined by Francis O'Brien, founder of the Fratelli Group, who was Chief of Staff to Peter Rodino, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, who did so much to shape the inquiry's outcome. And representing the staff of the impeachment inquiry, we have Judge Robert Sack, currently a senior judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Judge Sack was the senior associate special counsel on the impeachment inquiry. Providing an historian's perspective, we have Dr. Timothy Naftali, a faculty scholar at the Institute of Global Politics at Columbia School of International Public Affairs. Dr. Naftali authored the chapter on the Nixon impeachment in Impeachment and American History. Now, this first panel will be moderated by AEI Senior Fellow and presidential expert Gary Schmidt, who is writing a history of the original understanding of the presidency. I'd like to also just say a word about our second panel, which will assess the broader state of the impeachment power today. And our panelists for that panel include Jeffrey Tullis, Professor Emeritus at the University of Texas at Austin, and author of numerous books on the presidency, AEI Senior Fellow Philip Wallach, author of Why Congress, will also be with us, as will Keith Whittington, the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale and author of the forthcoming book, The Impeachment Power, the Law, Politics, and Purpose of an Extraordinary Constitutional Tool. We are hoping that AEI non-resident senior fellow and learned hand professor of law at Harvard, Jack Goldsmith, will be our moderator, but I understand the flights from Boston are moving slowly. So if Jack can't do it, I will. But he'll be better than me, and so let's say a Hail Mary for Jack. Now, one last thing. Before I turn things over to our first panel, I think it might be helpful to briefly review the events surrounding Watergate and the Judiciary Committee's inquiry to familiarize the audience with that essential context. Now, the undoing of the Nixon presidency took place over a 2-year period between June 1972 and August 1974. And I'm going to put up a chronology on the screen. It began on June 17, 1972, when 5 men were arrested breaking into the offices of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex. From August to October 1972, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post published stories describing the involvement of the Nixon administration officials in the financing of and response to the break-in. On November 7th, 1972, President Nixon was elected in one of the largest landslides in American political history, taking more than 60% of the popular vote and winning every state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. On May 18th, 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee begins its nationally televised hearings on the Watergate affair. On May 26, 1973, Attorney General designate Elliot Richardson appoints former Solicitor General Archibald Cox as the Justice Department's special prosecutor for Watergate. On October 20th, 1973, President Nixon fires Archibald Cox and Attorney General Richardson resigns. On November 1st, 1973, Acting Attorney General Robert Bork, a former AEI scholar, appoints Leon Jaworski as the second special prosecutor. And then in December 1973, the House Judiciary Committee impeachment inquiry begins under Chairman Peter Rodino, and John Doerr is named special counsel. On February 6, 1974, Chairman Rodino asked the full House of Representatives for explicit authorization to conduct the impeachment inquiry. The resolution passes with a vote of 410 to 4. May 9, 1974, the formal House Judiciary Committee evidentiary hearings begin on the impeachment of President Nixon. These hearings are held in executive session and go on for 10 weeks. July 27th to 30th, 1974, 50 years ago, 3 articles of impeachment are debated and approved by the House Judiciary Committee. 7 Republicans vote for at least 1 article, as do all of the Southern Democrats who came from districts that had voted overwhelmingly for President Nixon. And on August 5th, 1974, President Nixon releases transcripts of the conversations revealing Nixon's involvement in the Watergate cover-up beginning in June 1972. This confirmed the assertion contained in the Judiciary Committee's first article that subsequent to June 17th, President Nixon had participated personally and through his subordinates in the concealment of unlawful activity. And on August 8th and 9th, first, President Nixon resigns, and Vice President General Ford becomes president. Now, having provided that introductory context, I turn our discussion over to Gary and our first panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you all for joining us and those joining us online and eventually on C-SPAN. The format today is really quite simple. I'm going to begin by asking each of my panelists a first question. And after that, hopefully we'll have a conversation among the panel and myself. Occasionally I might toss in a question or two, but really want to have a conversation among folks who actually know from inside out the ongoings of the impeachment inquiry that the House Judiciary Committee was undertaking. And then finally, I'll turn to questions from you all at the end of the first panel. So let me begin with Francis. So after the Saturday night massacre, it's pretty clear that the House will have to begin an impeachment inquiry. You're relatively new to the Hill. Chairman Peter Rodino is a new chairman. And on top of all of that, the only precedent one has for impeaching inquiry is the Andrew Johnson impeachment inquiry that's a century old and pretty problematic at that. So let me begin by asking you, how did the chairman sort of sort through how to approach this new, essentially unprecedented impeachment inquiry? What were the principles that he had in mind? And then secondarily, sort of what are the major obstacles that he had in mind, you and he had in mind, or you had faced in trying to conduct the inquiry as you wanted? Please.
Thank you. Well, let's take it before October 20th, the Saturday Night Massacre. So for those of you old enough, the hearings on the Watergate were just mesmerizing. They were on television, and they just were. If you were interested in politics, you were glued to your television, and the Woodward Bernstein fact after fact kept pouring out about all the doings of this administration. Very strangely, over at the House, there was almost no activity at all. Now, that doesn't mean some of the most activist members of the Democratic Party weren't commenting on Nixon, et cetera, but the word impeachment was almost non-existent. I think, and Tim can correct me, I think during that whole, up to October 20th, maybe 1 or 2 members introduced articles. That would be maybe John Conyers from Michigan and maybe Bob Drinan from Massachusetts, maybe. They're very, what I call activists, on the activist wing of the Democratic Party. When I've given this talk before and I say the Saturday Night Massacre, October 20th, shocked the political class. If you weren't alive then and active, you don't know what I mean. But I now, 50 years later, can tell you of something that just happened that changed everything, and that was the past month, the debate. That debate shocked the political class. It's that exact same feeling that we had 50 years ago. It just took your breath away. And you can draw a line for Nixon from October 20th to August 8th of the next year, him resigning. You can draw a direct line from that debate. President Biden, I think I'm suffering from Bidenitis here, from President Biden to his decision not to run. It was that same shock that took place. So the interesting thing is, while all this is going on in the Senate and conversation, no one thought of impeachment. As Gary said, it hadn't been used, and it was used ineffectively over 100 years ago. It was considered a very extreme measure. And before October 20th of that year, Peter Rodino, who by then was the chairman, and myself and others, we never talked about it. It was not part of a conversation. You watch the events, not good, but impeachment was not privately or publicly a conversation that took place on the House side. That Saturday night that took place, that Monday, it was topic number one. And I can remember, I was in New York at the time, came back, and the chairman was in New Jersey. He was a congressman from Newark. Came back, and I can remember sitting in the office, and I can't remember 50 years ago what was exactly he said, but he said, I think this is going to become an issue. Now, it's interesting, he was not a fan of this. He thought, again, a very liberal Democrat, party line liberal. He was not an activist. And I always distinguish that between being liberal or conservative and are you an activist? And he was not. He was a very party line, been in the Senate for the House for many years. People in the House knew him. No one outside the House knew him because a congressman named Manny Seller had been the chairman of that committee for many years, a critically important, well-known congressman as he led most of the civil rights legislation that came out in the 60s. And so the chairman was brand new to the committee, as Gary says, I was too. But this is not something, it did not fit his personality. That's all I can say. It just, he thought it was a very extreme undertaking. But pressure mounted quite dramatically, and he felt that the committee could start doing a couple of things. And one of the things is no one knew, the first thing they said, let's do some research. What's the writings on this? This haven't happened in 100 years. So there was a scurrying around of trying to figure out what's the precedent here. And of course, there wasn't any. A couple of staff were hired on the Judiciary Committee to do some research. But as we moved deeper into October, November, the chairman came to the conclusion that you're going to need a separate staff from the judiciary. But first of all, back up a little, a decision had to be made by Kyle Albert and Tip O'Neill, the Speaker and the Majority Leader, that the investigation would reside in the Judiciary Committee and that Peter Rodino would be the chairman of that investigation. There was some pushback about that, again, from the most activist members of the Democratic Party inside of Congress and outside of Congress, because no one knew Rodino. They knew he was a liberal party line, but he had no reputation in the political community at large. There was no doubt in the Speaker's mind or the Majority Leader's mind that Peter Rodino would be the head because they had known him and trusted him and felt he was the exact personality, the exact person who would lead a very fair undertaking. And it's interesting, 50 years later, so Rodino, in those early days, did not think this was a tool that should be used. Nor at that time did he ever think that the President Nixon, would be charged with this. Very different. 50 years later, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee today was an advocate for impeachment. It's totally different culturally. Why he's important, and Congressman Cohen, Senator Cohen can talk about that as a freshman member of the committee. His attitude was to be as inclusive as possible. He said this 100 times to myself, and then he eventually chose John Doerr, a name you're somewhat familiar with in this group, as the chief counsel of the committee. One staff, bipartisan. Jenner, a man named Jenner, prominent lawyer from Jenner and Block in Chicago, was the Republican choice to co-counsel with John Doerr. Eventually, the staff, Bob Sachs and others, came to about 120 people. But the message always was the public has to feel this is a fair undertaking. He drilled that into every one of us. Whatever that decision would be, it had to be, didn't matter if you agreed or didn't agree, be a Republican or Democrat, you had to think it was a fair undertaking. And that was this constant message. And one of the attractions of his choosing John Doerr was actually instinctual. He felt that John Doerr shared that same kind of belief that this had to be a fair, not a partisan undertaking. So that, go ahead.
Oh, are you finished? I don't want to interrupt. Are you?
I can stop.
Okay.
I can stop.
Sorry. I don't want to cut anybody off. Senator Cohen, as Francis mentioned, you're a first-term congressman. Mm-hmm. I presume when you were running, you weren't thinking about things like impeachment inquiries. Can you talk a little bit about the impeachment inquiry begins, what your views about impeachment of the president, how you think about it at that point, but also if you can kind of tie together how you evolved in your thinking about impeachment with how the committee was being run, because I think that the two really important.
Gary, thank you very much. Robert Doerr has indicated we should be brief. And that's almost an impossible task to tell a former senator to be brief. So I'll try to summarize as quickly as I can. Two things come to mind this morning. We were just talking about last evening that President Biden made a speech in the Oval Office doing something we've only seen once or twice in our history. A person handing over peacefully the transfer of power before his term has expired. He did it with elegance last night. He spoke from the heart, and he talked about something that was really relevant to me as a young congressman being faced with a decision to possibly overturn the overwhelming vote for the President of the United States, someone I had voted for and campaigned for. And so it was the gravity of the circumstances then. And then we look to what we've had with a president being forced out because of Nixon, of corruption. He left before his term was up. So you have these bookends in history. Nixon because of corruption, Biden basically because of age, but a very different example of the peaceful transfer of power. But these two bookends are really important because going back to impeaching the President of the United States, we first had to decide, what do high crimes and misdemeanors mean? Is it a criminal act? Can it be less than a criminal act? Can it be, what's a misdemeanor? How do we judge that? So we had to go back into history, beyond simply the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. We had to go back into English history. And that's where I started reading some of the decisions in English history. And a quote that I came across, very important to me. It said, impeachment is like Goliath's sword, to be removed from the temple or the sheath on great occasions only. That's how important it was to talk about impeachment only on great occasions, because you are undertaking to overrule potentially the vote of millions and millions of the American people. It had to be something truly grave, a threat to our system. So in looking listening last night to what Joe Biden talked about, do we insist upon character today? He used the word honor and honesty. And another quote that came to mind when I was a young congressman is that of Justice Cardozo. He said a public servant is a trustee, a fiduciary, and a trustee owes you something higher than the morals of the marketplace. We owe you honor, the punctilio of an, not honesty alone, that's important, but the punctilio of an honor the most sensitive. And those words really meant something to me then. We want our president to be up here. We don't want to lower what he or she can do. We want the president who is a trustee. That's what we mean by a public servant. You're serving the interests of the public. So we want you to act with honor and honesty. And so those standards were the ones for me as I looked and listened to all the evidence. I had memorized the hearings that took place in the Senate, had committed them all to memory so that I would understand the witnesses who came before us, whether there were any change. And so I had that as a base. And then I listened to the tapes. And I will tell you, if not for the tapes, there would have been no impeachment. And one thing I've learned from the impeachment process, you must be bipartisan. You must have a bipartisan consensus in that committee. If it's simply a majority, you can pass it, but it's meaningless. It will not go to the Senate. It won't have any meaning. So you take Goliath's sword and you turn it into a butter knife. It doesn't mean anything unless you have people willing to say, yes, that is unacceptable. Yes, it's unacceptable for a president to bribe, just to pay money to purchase silence. We saw most recently in the trial in New York, a president paying money to purchase silence. Different issue, but nonetheless, we had Nixon paying money to purchase silence. We had Nixon calling upon the CIA to intervene in the investigation with the FBI. So he kept looking down the list of things. We said, is this acceptable conduct for the President of the United States, a fiduciary, someone who must give us honor and honesty? And that's how I went about it with the other Republicans who went about it, to say, we won't accept this. We want our president, the person we voted for, to be up here. We want him to be a trustee. We don't want him to be a criminal or to someone engage in conduct. It doesn't have to even be criminal in terms of a crime. If he engages in conduct that is antithetical to everything we believe that we want in the President of the United States, that's the standard. And that's what I took away from Chairman Rodino and John Doerr. John Doerr made sure that we proceeded on bipartisan basis. The committee staff on the Democratic side, to be sure, Burt Jenner on the Republican side. We have to see if we can agree on several issues. And if we can't agree, then it's going nowhere. And we finally came together with 7 of the so-called fragile coalition and passed at least 2 resolutions. I'll stop there. Okay.
Thanks, Senator. Thank you very much. Judge Sack, you are a senior deputy to Staff Counsel John Doerr and in charge of the task force looking into abuses of power by President Nixon. You were, as you might say in your own courtroom, a witness to the inner workings of the staff. 5 decades later, how do you remember those days and the character of the staff's work?
I got to start, I'm a judge, I start where I want, right? I start somewhere else. Something happened in the last hour. I learned something 50 years later that I didn't know. And that is, how did I get down there from being a very young partner doing newspaper defense work? How did I get down to Washington? Well, there had come to my firm, Patterson, Dunlap and Webb, a man named D. Robert Owen. His father was a parson from Texas. My father was a rabbi from Park Slope in Brooklyn. Somehow we were almost exactly the same. Anyhow, we were very, very close friends. And he came in and he said, "Geez, Bob, what are you doing for the next 6 months?" And that was a funny question. And I said, "Gee, why?" And he said, "Well, would you be willing to go down to Washington for the next 6 months?" And I swear my answer was, my father spent, in the war, my father spent a year in New Guinea. I can spend 6 months in Washington. I didn't realize, it turns out 6 months in Washington, it's hotter here than it is in New Guinea. But I didn't know that at the time. So but I say this all only because of what I learned in the last hour. And that is, Robert Dorr is named after my friend D. Robert Owen. And I didn't know that, and I'm kind of stunned. It's worth a whole trip here and back just to learn that. No kidding. Now, I have ultimately just three stories that I wanted to share with you, and I hope I will be able to share with you. But I'll start with one of the three stories from the staff, and that was when we were actually across the street. Must have been July. We were across the street. For us, across the street meant in the hearing room committee, and my, again, dear friend for many years, passed away a couple of years ago. His name was Bernie Nussbaum, very senior to me. Bernie Nussbaum was a fine, excellent, well-regarded New York lawyer for his entire career. But when he wasn't working on some public service. And we were making a presentation, or the staff was making a presentation, and his parents were immigrants from Poland. And amongst other things that he did is he spoke like a machine gun. That's it. He would run out like that. And he was kind of well known for that, highly respected, but that was one of his things he was well known for. And so he gets up and he has to make a presentation. And he gets up and he says, members of Congress, members of the committee, I see it's getting to be lunchtime, I have to report on this, but I will be quick. And I remember, it may be wrong, as Congressman Butler, I guess it is, from North Carolina, from Virginia. And he says, "Mr. Nussbaum, please be bright, be brief, do not be quick." Now, I plan to follow that instruction, and I trust you will let me get to my two stories. I'm a witness, mind you. I'm not Tim Naftali, who was an expert, who studied this, who knows what went on. I just was there 50 years ago. And I remember a lot of little shards of things, but that's what I remember, and that's what a witness does. Says what he remembers, and then I hope I don't get cross-examined afterwards, but that's what he does. And I do remember all kinds of things, but we must face the fact that after 50 years, and I think we faced the fact in the last couple of days, but after 50 years, the memory doesn't exactly get sharper every year. My father, when he was roughly my age, a little younger, told me that he wanted me to know that he had Alzheimer's disease. I said, Dad, what is Alzheimer's disease? He says, that's when you can't remember the word Alzheimer. So I remember, of course, there's an irony here. The irony is that it was more than 25 years ago, and I remember it, but we'll leave that alone. I remember, and this I think is what important, that there were three different aspects, at least three that I knew of impeachment. It just wasn't one experience. First, and in my mind, foremost, was 100 people, 40 of them lawyers, and we were there, didn't know each other, selected all by, well, at least the Democrats, by John Doerr. Here we were in the midst of a national crisis, kind of locked away together in the old Congressional Hotel. We became each other's life raft. We were there for 12 hours a day, and we didn't know whether we were on some enemy's list. It's terribly important to remember that we did not know in January what was going to happen in February, let alone what was going to happen in August. And so it was all suspense. We didn't know, and we clutched to each other and became wonderful friends. To give you an example, simple example, last Friday, not unusual, last Friday, we had six of us, on a Zoom call for an hour, 50 years later, an hour, just talking about what's going on in the world and what am I going to do today and how is the weather. And it's going to happen a week from Friday, and it's going to happen after that. 50 years later, mind you, was this intense? Closest friends are the people, and some of the most wonderful people, are the people who we met there. Now, if you want to know more about the group, if for any reason you want to know more about that group, the answer is 13 years ago, almost 13 years ago, Tim Naftali did, he'll know how many, he did a bunch of interviews for, I guess you can get it right now, I think they're on C-SPAN, but you can get them, I've got them in the last 2 weeks. And they have the interviews of the staff members. And believe it or not, 13 years ago, their memories and my memory was better than it is now, but they're marvelous. The other day, I spent a good part of the afternoon with my old friend Bernard Nussbaum, listening to him be interviewed. Bernie has been dead for 2.5 years, and I spent the day with Bernie Nussbaum. So if you want to know about the people aspect, go to the tapes. The second thing was what we did as a staff. We did a few interviews. No, basic rule, we did no investigation. But we had a vast amount of material. There had been the Irving Committee, which had a lot of enormous amounts of interviews and tapes and documents. And so we gathered that material up. The Special Prosecutor's Office, in a kind of what was then a famous moment, delivered a suitcase full of material, and John Doerr went out in front of the old Congressional Hotel and grabbed it. We had lots and lots of material, but no investigation. So our job for the first 3 or 4 months was nothing but people that were doing nothing but 8-10 hours a day. Each of us, we were divided into groups, and I was in charge of a big, less important group, which was called agency practices. Not agency abuse. We would never use a term like agency abuse because it's biased. Agency practices. And we had 35 different subjects that we went into, and we got all the documents and read them and put them in order, and turned them into what were called statements of information. Now, mind you, they were called statements of information, not statements of facts, because we were going to be as straight down the middle as possible. The Congress was going to decide what the facts were. We were going to tell them what the information was. So we had a vast amount of material documents coming in, sorted out into stories, and then put into and then sent across the street, out the front door of the old Congressional Hotel, across the street to the House of Representatives. And people thought we weren't doing anything because we weren't out there investigating. But I have since found out that there really was a lot going on outside of what our staff was doing, and I learned that by reading more than twice, reading Robert Doerr's, what's going to become Robert Doerr's book. Not to say that it's the only book. The gentleman on my left has probably read more books than I'm ever going to read. I mean, written more books than I'm ever going to read. But I read them and started to understand how small a piece what we were doing, because we never crossed the street to Congress, let alone going to the White House or to the Senate. So documents was a big thing, and there was a woman named Maureen Barden, who was 10 years younger than I was, and she was in charge of a staff of young people, and their job was to get the documents coming in, read whatever, put together whatever the rest of the staff had done, the lawyers had done, and then put them into these books of information. And we took the books of information, big black books, and sent them across the street. In the second 3 or 4 months, we were trying to explain what the books of information had to Congress. But again, the small amount of what we knew of what was going on reminded me of a story that my mother used to tell about a tuba player in the New York Philharmonic, and they were doing Mahler's first. And following, the tuba player had the next week off, and they wondered what he was going to do. And so he decided he was going to go to the Carnegie Hall and listen to the Philadelphia Orchestra play Mahler's first. So he went, listened, came back, and his wife said, what was it like? Did you enjoy it? He says, it's amazing, Mahler's, it's amazing. He says, we're playing it, and I'm playing the tuba. I'm going oompa, oompa, oompa. Did you know there's beautiful music there? And it was the kind of that way in reading the book. Okay, now my two stories from then, and I'm sorry it takes so long, but two stories. First, Joe Woods, buddy of John Doerr from California. Well, he was a law person. He was in charge, not of the facts which the rest of us were dealing with, but the law of impeachment. And one day, I would have guessed it was March, he had a little meeting in his room at 7:30, 8 o'clock, and I was there. With Fred Altsler, who you may not know, and Hillary Rodham, who you probably have heard of. And the two of them and Joe Woods were there with me. And I don't know what it was, a piece of paper, whether I told something, I was asked to do something. Well, Joe Woods came down on me with like a house of bricks. He thought it was terrible, and he told me how terrible it was, and how can you, and I felt we were scared enough as it was. I thought I was terrified and angry and so sad. And I went and started to pack up my bag to go home to my family. And I go out, and my car in Congress. It was seniority, and I was the least senior person in the world. So my car, I think it had one wheel in the Potomac River. I mean, it was way, way down. So I'm walking down, block, 2 blocks, and then I hear this little pitter-patter of feet running behind me. And I turn around, and there's Fred Altshuler and Hillary Rodham running after me. And they came back and literally patted me on the back and said, look, don't worry about it. It wasn't that bad. Nobody's going to remember it. Everything's going to be fine. Just don't worry about it. That was the sweetest thing anybody had ever done to me. I can't talk about it now without tearing up a little bit, because we were so vulnerable. And the support from our colleagues was a lifesaver. Last story. When eventually the transcripts came over, I think we got them from, I don't mean the transcripts, the tapes. Tapes came over, the transcripts came from the White House. The White House prepared transcripts, which weren't very good, but they prepared transcripts. And so our staff, 3 people on our staff, decided that they were told to make, when they got better tapes, to make perfect transcripts. 3 of them to make perfect transcripts of the White House tapes, the Richard Nixon tapes. And so they did, they completed them, and then they were delivered across the street. And I think they were either delivered or leaked, you can hardly tell the difference, to the press at that point. So one afternoon, I hear pitter-patter of big feet coming down the hall, and it's Maureen Barden. And she says, Bob, I need some help. I said, well, what? And she says, Bob, I've been getting calls from newspapers all over, Washington Post, sure, but a place I never even heard, asking me, who is Earl Nash? Of course, I don't know. And she says, I looked, and she says, in one of our transcripts, it says, somebody asked Haldeman a question, something about national, security, and asked him, how will we explain what's going on? And Haldeman or Ehrlichman says, Earl Nash. And that's what our transcript says, our perfect transcript, Earl Nash. So she says, Bob, could you call him up and find out who he is and what's going on? And I found a name in the phone book in Virginia, near Virginia, and find out who Earl Nash is. I said I was supposed to do everything I was asked. I did. I pick up on the phone and I call. And I rings a couple of times, and then I get a woman on the phone. And I say, excuse me, can you tell me who is Earl Nash? And she starts to cry, and then she starts to bawl. And she said, Earl Nash is my husband. He's a traveling salesman. I can't even reach him. I think he's somewhere in Indiana now. And but they're all these. Can you explain to me do you know what's going on? And I said, no, but we'll find out and we'll take care of it. I understand if he has nothing to do with this, we'll let the press know or tell them. But we had to find out what happened. And so we go back to our perfect transcripts that we had prepared. And we go to this conversation. And the president, we still call him that, the president said to Haldeman or Ehrlichman, he says, how are we going to explain this? And he said, national security. And that was transcribed into Earl Nash. And to this day, when I have dinner with my friends, there's always a place on the table for Earl Nash.
Thanks, Judge. Tim. The judge has already introduced you as being the definitive historian on, on the Nixon impeachment. So what are we missing? What are the points that you think we should also remember about the inquiry?
Well, I want to just mention Chris DeMuth's name because when I was director of the Nixon Library, he invited me to come and speak before AEI. This is my second time here, and I'm happy to be here. I want to make a few points to pull together what these heroes have said. I learned about the Nixon impeachment.
Can I just interrupt? So Chris DeMuth had an office in the basement of the White House.
Yes.
Is that what you were going to?
No, I'm going to, as part of the oral history, I had interviewed him, but I just wanted to mention that it was my second time.
Well, I was just going to say, they moved him out of that office to put the taping system.
I want to make a few points because as director of a presidential library, I worked for you. So the research I did was for the American people, and everything we've talked about, you can access yourselves. And it was an unusual task that I had, but because the US government, at the request of the Nixon family, was taking over what had been a private Nixon library, and I was going to be the first director, we were taking over its museum, and it had a Watergate exhibit. And the family, as it was explained to me, couldn't agree on how to alter it, revise it, since President Nixon had actually edited the text of the museum. And so it was decided that as the first director, I would write the text of this public history of Watergate in a federal institution. The irony was I was not an expert about Watergate. I wasn't really an expert about Nixon. I was hired for the job because I knew something about tapes. I'd run a program at the University of Virginia. But largely, I was hired because I dealt with Russians, and they're tough to deal with. And the new archivist of the United States knew that this would be a tough assignment. Well, one of the things I learned about this, and I want to share it with you because I see some young faces in the audience, and I want you to, first of all, to forget about everything you know about impeachment because you have seen two of them. I want to explain to you how impeachment is supposed to work. And I want you to think about, one of the takeaways I want you to think about is whether I'm describing Mars, an alien society that existed once and will never exist before, or whether, and this is my pious hope, I suppose, whether partisanship is a choice. Because in what I learned, as your steward, if you will, was that a number of people made very important choices that perhaps a generation, the current one in power, won't make, but it doesn't mean future generations won't make. So I'd like to very quickly talk about those choices and how interesting they are. And in a sense, they've been hinted at by all of our guests, your guests. The first choice was the set of choices made by Peter Rodino. Peter Rodino, and Francis knows way more about it, Peter Rodino was not a very well-respected chair. He was expected to be dominated by the top tier of the Democratic Party. In other words, he was supposed to be partisan. It was assumed that this whole process would be, and this you will have seen this before, a totally partisan impeachment. Peter Rodino, for reasons that Francis knows well, and I never had the good fortune to meet Peter Rodino, decided that for this process to work, it actually had to be bipartisan. Now, I want you, since you all live in Washington, to think about how unusual it would be for someone whose first moment in the glare of public recognition, this man was not known. He had replaced a lion of the House who had been beaten by the AOC of that generation, Liz Holtzman. He chose to buck the partisans in his caucus to create a bipartisan approach. And when I say buck, I want you to know there were efforts to remove him because he wasn't partisan enough. Imagine that in Washington. It's so easy to be partisan because all your friends, all your buddies love you. Imagine making the choice to do something for the nation. And so that's one, but it's not a story of one person. That's what makes this so interesting. This cannot be explained by one person. It's a series of people in different positions with different responsibilities, all of whom have read the Constitution. All right, next, Bob's father. I can hardly talk about Mr. Dorr, whom I had the chance to meet once, without tearing up. I tear up. He was a very good man, and I'm sure he was a great father. I tear up because of what he represents. Robert Dorr was he was a Republican, he was an Eisenhower appointee who believed in civil rights. Again, for you young folks, there was a time when the Republican Party was the party of civil rights in the United States. It may be someday in the future, and I won't make any more statements of partisan, but it was. All right? Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, was a devoted Republican. And John Dorr came from that tradition of Republicans who go back to Lincoln. John Dorr, therefore, was a civil servant in the Department of Justice who stayed under the next administration, John F. Kennedy's, and worked for Robert F. Kennedy. John Dorr was a master at winning cases in courtrooms that were biased. He had learned how to try cases in the South on behalf of people of color. And one of the things he learned was you have to overwhelm the jury with information. You can't have a slender case. You have to overwhelm them. And it was that theory that he took into this process. And this is something that Bob Sachs was alluding to when he talked about the material they amassed for this. It's not that he thought the Republicans on the committee were like Southern jurors, but Dorr recognized that in order to do something hard, which was impeachment, the country hadn't done it for 100 years, you'd have to overwhelm folks with the enormity of President Nixon's crimes and abuses of power. And I'd like to read something. This is actually from Bob Dorr's work that he gave to Caldwell Butler, who was a part of he was on the committee, and I did some research in his papers. And Mr. Dorr explained the following about his approach to thinking about if one were to make a case about impeachment. I thought, he wrote in a diary, I guess it was contemporaneously that Mr. Dorr wrote this, I thought that the country shouldn't be left with making a decision about impeaching a president on the conduct of the president on one day. I thought that was not going to help the country get over this. And so we tried to pull everything together of the president's conduct over a period of time. So this man was thinking of the nation. In fact, he had a disagreement with the prosecutors, the special prosecutors, because he felt the special prosecutors were just trying to try a case in a court, and they were looking for one crime. And then I'd like to mention the members of the committee. Senator Cohen, Secretary Cohen, represents a group of great patriots. They were Republicans, but they were also Democrats because they showed political courage. In that era, for a Democrat to show political courage, it was to be against Nixon. Southern Democrats were part of a new coalition of conservatives that Richard Nixon was building because he actually, which is one reason why he wasn't as popular with rank-and-file Republicans in office. He wanted to move past the Republican Party. He wanted to create a new conservative party that would be based on Southern Democrats, which is why he loved a man named John Connally and had wanted John Connally, former governor of Texas, to be his vice president, and Connally would have been president of the United States. Republicans in the House said to the president, you're not getting your choice for vice president. You're going to get our choice, Gerald Ford. And that's how Gerald Ford becomes president of the United States. In any case, these Southern Democrats and Republicans decided to treat this impeachment the way the founders wanted it treated, which is as jurors in a constitutional trial, not as members of a party. Remember, all of us know this, the founders hated factions. They hated parties. They didn't want parties. They did not anticipate that there would be a president's party that would make removing a president by 2/3 vote in the Senate impossible. They just didn't think it was possible. They hadn't thought about it. They expected these senators and the senators in the trial and earlier, the members of the House in what we consider a grand jury, to think as Americans, as constitutionalists, not as members of a party. That's what the bellwether group in the committee did. And how they went about it, perhaps in the Q&A, Senator Cohen can tell you more about it. It is remarkable. These were Americans from all over, from Virginia, from Maine, from South Carolina, from Arkansas, from Wisconsin. They were from all over the country. It didn't matter where they were from. They were Americans first and foremost. This is a remarkable story. And then, of course, there's a final player in this story, and that's Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was not bipartisan. But for all of his failures and all of his flaws, Richard Nixon believed in the institutions of the federal government. And so, even though he wanted to game the system and he did some dirty tricks, for example, he tried to put pressure on one member of the coalition, an Illinois Republican, and tried to get his chief fundraiser, his chief financial backer, John Deere, to go against him if he voted against the president. Even though the president did dirty tricks, he also believed the public expected him to respect the process, so he actually handed over material. Richard Nixon did not stonewall the proceedings. So everybody, even the man who would lose in the process, believed that the institutions of the country required at least a semblance of constitutional duty and understanding. So just keep in mind, partisanship is a choice. It's not expected by our founders. It is not actually linked to the nature of this country. It is a late-form phenomenon in American history. But impeachment is an early form of American duty, and this generation attacked and approached that duty the way the founders wanted them to. So the question is whether we are ever going to be capable of that kind of commitment to the ideals that made us the great nation we are.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm going to turn to questions, but before doing so, I wanted to give Senator Cohen a chance to make a few remarks, final remarks.
I'll just pick up on what Tim is saying. The question is, what are the lessons of Watergate, and do they apply today? Is there any chance that you would have that kind of capability of bringing people together, pursuing and insisting upon the validity of the rule of law? What is troubling to me in this country is we have lost respect for our institutions. And we have people running for office who are determined to undercut that respect for institutions. And so you can say, I want to pull the Justice Department into the arm of the White House. Well, what does that do in terms of respect for the rule of law? You have one candidate who says, well, I feel we should be able to shoot protesters in the street who are unarmed. Is that consistent with the powers of the presidency under the ruling of the Supreme Court? That a president can do whatever he or she wants, and the court will determine at some time in the future whether that exceeds the bounds. So what I am worried about today is that we have lost the lessons of Watergate, that we insist upon the President of the United States as being our highest official, the person that none of us, we go abroad, we never speak ill of the President of the United States. He's our president. And I want him to be as Reagan was. When he walked into the room, he was our president. And you knew that he believed in the rule of law, but one exception, I'll get into it another time. But he believed in the rule of law and apologized for when it got out of hand in terms of the Iran-Contra. So do we today expect our President of the United States to be up here? When Joe Biden last night said honor, honesty, character, do we insist upon that, or are we so caught up with entertainment, with the trivialization of a process, that we no longer have faith in the Justice Department, we no longer have faith in the FBI, we no longer have faith in any institution. We want to abolish them and start from the beginning, according to some. So my fear is we have forgotten the lessons of Watergate. There were great reforms after Watergate. We said we can't tolerate the abuse of power. We insist that we have some limitation on fundraising. Remember that? We tried to limit the amount of money coming into our system. Today there are no limits. And we don't even know where they're coming from. And we don't care. It's just free speech for corporations, for people, for dark companies who have dark money, et cetera. So my fear is we've come kind of full circle. We've seen what impeachment was. And the question what we've seen today is we don't have people willing to say, Mr. President, you can't encourage an insurrection. You can't, Nixon had his burglar group. Another president had his Boogaloos and the Proud Boys and the others storming the Capitol. There was no peaceful transfer of power. I'm holding on to it. And we have to remember what this country is supposed to be about, that we hold everybody, presidents especially, to that rule of law. You're acting as a fiduciary. You're a trustee. And we're going to make sure you conduct yourself as a trustee.
Thanks, Senator. Let the record show I've been a very moderate moderator. Question here, and please wait for the microphone and identify yourself, and as always, ask a question.
J.P. Hogan. I can remember Bill and Hillary introducing themselves to me in 1972. Before this, I was about age 7. But on this, it's going to go to J. Edgar Hoover because it seemed Nixon had legitimate cause to investigate the headquarters. Why was Hoover afraid to do a legitimate investigation that then became, well, before this chronology, if you know the break-in happened, there's a case that Mark Felt opened up a case file, and the case file would have had a nickname, Deep Throat. So there's a history of Mark Felt stayed secret because he was protecting minors. And Nixon lost his presidency more.
I'm sorry, you have to ask a question.
The question's
we're running
there,
out of
but the
time.
question is about why wasn't there, Nixon was impeached because he botched what could have been a justified investigation. But it's a matter of.
Anybody? Okay. Another question?
Well, I do want to.
Okay.
I will say one thing that this was the period of the imperial presidency, and Democrats before Nixon had used the FBI to a certain extent to do political investigations. There was a gray area in the Constitution, which the Supreme Court has now decided to wrap together and hand to a future president as an area where they can now engage in criminal activities without any fear of adjudication. So when Nixon did not get the institutional assistance that he wanted to engage in political use of intelligence, then he created his own. So what had happened is the FBI in particular, because Hoover had changed his approach, had moved away from saying yes to presidents to do what it used to do. What it had done for LBJ and for for JFK and for Eisenhower and for Truman and for FDR. Hoover wouldn't do it for Nixon. But those aren't legitimate uses of the FBI. It was just that Hoover wasn't willing to do them anymore. Similarly, the CIA was not willing to do everything that Nixon wanted the CIA to do in the United States. So Nixon set up an organization to undertake illegal covert operations in this country because the existing institutions wouldn't do them anymore. And he gets caught because he reuses the same team for his domestic covert operations against Daniel Ellsberg. He reuses them for his illegal domestic espionage operations in the '72 election. And that's what happened.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Charlie Fiore. I'm a government relations intern here at AEI. And my question for the panel is, how do you think the Watergate scandal and the subsequent impeachment of Nixon changed the way the American public views the presidency and the powers of the executive branch?
Well, I think again, Watergate was a seminal issue at the time in 1972. I think its lessons have been weakened and ignored in terms of the concentration of power and the abuse of power. I would say today that Watergate is not as significant an issue in today's environment. We didn't have social media in our day. We didn't have the level of information, disinformation, misinformation that is seeping through our society, and the amount of cruelty and the amount of violence. We had death threats back in 1972. I certainly received them, the committee received them, we had a bomb threat. So it's not as if we didn't have violence then, but not at the level today where if you disagree with someone, you can have an act of political violence which is seen as a legitimate expression of free speech. That is a real danger today, that we have mobilized people to think it's okay to threaten other people by phone or in person, by letter, by email, that is a form of intimidation. That's okay, you can dox people. You can give their names and their addresses, and then suddenly you've got people who are receiving death threats, including members of the Supreme Court. So today we have a very different level of concern about power, political power and the legitimate use of that, where you can have a president of the United States ask his Secretary of Defense, why can't we shoot them in the knees? I mean, think about that you have a president say, why can't we stop these protests? They may be peaceful, but they're interrupting commerce. So shoot them. And you had a Secretary of Defense who said no. So we have gotten used to the notion that the use of power by a president or those in high office does not have restraint. And I think the most recent Supreme Court really is very dangerous in terms of saying that you really can't control. You can no longer constrain the far edges of executive power. And so they left it to the future to define what that is. And so anyway, I could carry on about this, but you have other members of the panel that may have something to say. I just think the lessons, we have lost them. They were good for a while. They were searing in the nation's conscience. They became relevant during Iran-Contra, et cetera. But the notion that the president must abide by the rule of law, and Tim will tell you that President Nixon did believe in the rule of law. Ultimately, he handed over power. For a different reason. He knew he was going to be removed, but he handed it over. President Biden handed it over because of health issues. You've got another president who said, I ain't handing it over. Take it from me. And so we have a different mood altogether now, and people do not respect the rule of law the way we did on the committee and the reverence for our institution. That is no longer there, and it needs to be back.
Well, we've run out of time for this panel. I apologize, but we've had an interesting discussion and comments, and just a bit of housekeeping. If you'd stay seated while we have our second set of panelists up here and make the exchange. But before doing that, please join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
My name is Jack Goldsmith. Robert has already introduced our panelists, and we're running a little bit behind, so we're just going to jump right into the conversation, which is about the state of impeachment today. Philip Wallach is going to start us off by talking about current events, putting the recent impeachment events in context and together. And then Jeff Toulis and Keith Whittington will talk about larger perspectives on the impeachment process and what it has come to. Then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions. We're running a little bit behind time, so we're going to have to compress things a little bit. Phil.
Okay. Well, let me start out with a quote. I'll tell you who said it in a minute. Here's what he said. At this particular juncture in America's history, the Senate is being called to sit as the high court of impeachment all too frequently. Indeed, we are living in what I think can aptly be described as the age of impeachment. He went on to ask, how did we get here, and offered some meditations on the rise of the independent counsels. And he quoted Justice Scalia's Morrison v. Olson dissent about that statute, the independent counsel, the context of this statute is acrid with the smell of threatened impeachment. He said, presidential impeachment is tantamount to domestic war, filled with acrimony, and it divides the country like nothing else. That was Kenneth Starr speaking on behalf of President Trump at his first impeachment trial in the Senate in early 2020. Starr, of course, famously was the face of the push to impeach President Clinton in the 90s. He, for 4 years, had a role as an independent counsel investigating Clinton, and after 4 years of investigating on a range of topics, eventually delivered the famous Starr report to Congress in fall of 1998, and the Republican Congress at that time moved quickly toward impeachment. My main purpose here in running really fast through all the history of impeachment since that Clinton impeachment is to just substantiate what the folks on the first panel already told you, which is that the impeachments since Nixon have not had a process that looked anything like the bipartisan process that played out in 1974. The Republicans pushed 4 articles of impeachment, and they did get 5 Democratic votes in the House of Representatives for 3 of those articles, I think. At least 2 of those articles, the ones that ultimately passed, for perjury and obstruction of justice. 5 Democrats, 3 of whom subsequently became Republicans. And they had few Republicans voting against those impeachment resolutions. And then in the Senate, it was a pretty straight partisan affair. Some Republicans did not vote to convict on both counts, but you saw that coming up short. Really setting a feeling that impeachment was a partisan thing. It didn't sit very well with the American people. Most folks thought that it contributed to Republicans' poor showing in the 1998 midterm elections. But there it was. And sort of by the logic of tit for tat, it sort of seemed like it was not just Watergate, not just a one-off with Nixon, but something that was out there in the political bloodstream. And since then, we've really seen a much steadier drumbeat of demands for impeachment. We saw Dennis Kucinich mount a push for the impeachment of George W. Bush. That never got much sympathy from congressional leaders. But we did see kind of executive congressional relations souring through the Bush and Obama years, right? We saw a lot of contempt citations get voted through the House of Representatives. Harriet Miers, Josh Bolton, during the Obama years, Eric Holder, Lois Lerner. Obama, there was some push for Obama impeachment, but John Boehner mostly tamped down on that, and they never got anywhere. But with the election of Donald Trump, it sort of surged back with a vengeance. It was clear that there were some people who wanted to impeach Trump from, day -1 before he ever took office, thinking about ways of impeaching him. When Democrats won the 2018 midterm, that became a very live issue, a central point of contention within the Democratic caucus. Should we move forward with what we've got? And Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, mostly tamped down on that. She thought it wasn't opportune until the famous whistleblower complaint came out in 2019, and they decided that that was a significant abuse of power enough to move forward with impeachment in late 2019. They didn't manage to make that a bipartisan proceeding. That was sort of Trump's troops rallied behind him, and in some ways he sort of solidified his support among Republicans as a result of that impeachment push. Then, of course, we get January 6th and the second impeachment. I am a deep believer that Democrats really missed an opportunity by not looking for a way to cooperate on a bipartisan impeachment push in that short time available to them before Trump left office. We saw, as of the wee hours of January 7th, some Democrats thinking about how can we push impeachment through. But they were acting as partisan Democrats. They never really brought in Republican partners, even though it was clear that some Republicans were sympathetic to the idea that Trump should be impeached for his conduct on January 6th. They didn't figure out a way that they could write that in a way that would bring in Republicans. They were also distracted by the possibility of doing a 25th Amendment push to get Trump out of office, but it really never got any bipartisan legs as a formal push. It was a hard thing to do since there was so little time. And Republicans, tit for tat, have looked for opportunities to impeach Joe Biden. There's kind of a cottage industry of impeachment resolutions, largely centered on Representative Greene's office. She's introduced a whole lot all by herself. Republican leaders have steered instead toward this impeachment of a cabinet secretary. For the first time since 1876, we had a cabinet secretary impeached. The Senate treated that as a partisan aberration that they wanted to shuffle off as quickly as possible. So the state of impeachment today is as a partisan tit-for-tat exercise that's almost become a de rigueur part of our polarized political environment. It's a far stretch from what we saw in 1974. And I think for those of us who are worried about presidential aggrandizement and abuse of power, it sort of seems like the energy has been sapped from this tool in a way that's very concerning. That it's almost hard to imagine it transcending the bounds of this partisanship at this point. So I'll leave my remarks there.
Jeff.
So my remarks sort of dovetail with what Tim Naftali and Senator Secretary Cohen said. I'm not sure I can improve on what they said, but I have a bit of a longer lens on their observations. And it begins with the observation that the entire governmental order in the United States, when it was invented, was extraordinarily original and complex, and that included the invention of the impeachment process. And to highlight that complexity, I want to stress at the outset that the impeachment process is basically designed constitutionally as an analogy. It's analogized to a legal process. So the House is like a grand jury and the Senate tries. The word trial is used, but the prosecutors are managers. The jurors turn out to be actual politicians, senators, but they take a new oath. The jury is presided over by the chief, when it's the president who is impeached, by the Chief Justice of the United States, who the Constitution mandates with the word shall has to be the presiding officer, so that the Senate then is the same room, and it's the same building, and it's the same individuals, but they have to recompose themselves into a new body. They're something different than they were or supposed to be when they're in ordinary politics. And signifying that they take a completely new oath, even though they've taken an oath of office already. Now, that notion that impeachment is like a legal process, but it's different in the ways that I just outlined, raises the question, why? And the easy answer is, well, it's a sort of quasi-legal process. But that's another way of saying it's an attempt to create a process of high politics, of politics that is unusual. It's still politics, but it's not ordinary politics. Or in the words of Phil and some of the previous speakers, it's not ordinary partisan politics. So the architecture is designed to induce this new kind of politics. And that kind of architecture is inherently unstable because if you take it really seriously, or you might say too seriously, and And if the defenders of one impeached exploits this aspect of it, you can make it too legalistic. That's what happens with Andrew Johnson, and because of Andrew Johnson, it happens also eventually with Nixon, Clinton, and Trump as well, where the polity is told that you have to find some crime that is recognizable to citizens as a crime in the ordinary criminal code, even though a crime of high politics would be something that may not be a crime in the ordinary criminal code, although it may include some that are. A crime of high politics would be a form of serious abuse of office. Now, if you point this out assiduously, you could have the unstable problem go in the other direction, the one that Phil started to outline, which is that you realize that it is some sort of political process, but then it becomes too political or too partisan. So the instability is either it's too legalistic or too partisan. One of the good aspects, rare aspects of the failures of the impeachment process in the Trump era is that it has reawakened people to the possibility that there might be a good notion of political that needs to be recovered, that serious abuses of office really need this, this solution, became more palpable when the court decided that the disqualification aspects of the Constitution wouldn't be enforced, that it had to be either an election or an impeachment and conviction. I want to close by taking a little bit of issue, however, with my colleague, who, by the way, has a really great book out on Congress that I highly recommend, Phil's argument that what we have today is the failure of people to be bipartisan. I mean, it's true, but that's not so much an indication of the problem of the Democrats. That's the problem of the Republicans. And the reason it's the problem of Republicans is because of a relatively recent phenomena that was first most articulately charted by a fellow of this institution, Norm Ornstein, and that's the phenomenon of hyperpartisanship. Hyperpartisanship is when you stand up for your party as tribe, no matter what the party does, including taking positions antithetical to the positions that your party had previously taken, just in order not to help somebody else, even though it's going to not advance purposes that you presumably had been for as a partisan. Hyperpartisanship came to mark the Trump era in ways that are incredibly damaging, and I just want to close by giving a bit of evidence for that. The first is that the oath, the special oath of office that I mentioned that senators take when they become jurors, was disparaged by Mitch McConnell, by Lindsey Graham, by Ted Cruz. Not just that they didn't live up to their oaths, they mocked the oath-taking aspect itself. Secondly, in the second Trump impeachment trial, and this is not a question of hyperpartisanship, but of judicial, I don't know what the right word would be, but let's just say incompetence, that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court refused to preside over the most serious impeachment that we've had in this country, refused to preside over it, and of course the Congress didn't attempt to hold him to that. I want to end by saying the significance of this failure of the most significant, serious impeachment inquiry and trial in our history, the second Trump impeachment, is it suggests that the failure of bipartisanship is a symptom of a failure of the constitutional order. It's not just a symptom of the failure of individuals, though I heartily endorse the earlier speakers, both chastisement and heralding of a hope that we would have more responsible leaders in the future. Thank you.
So I want to echo themes related to what we've just heard about, which is the intrinsically political nature of the impeachment power and how to think about that political nature in general. And for now, I don't want to emphasize the unavoidable fact that impeachments are going to involve decisions by elected representatives. And that's necessarily going to mean that there's going to be some political calculations as part of that, of the type that Phil and Jeff both mentioned. And that includes the fact that they operate within a partisan environment as well as a larger electoral environment. And that's going to be somewhat inevitable as part of their decision making. The aspect of the political nature of the impeachment process, though, that I want to emphasize is the extent to which the impeachment power is designed to solve a certain kind of political problem. It's a feature of our constitutional system of checks and balances in which the founders understood that there's going to be certain kinds of political problems that might arise within our constitutional structure. They're going to need political solutions of a particularly extraordinary type. And the impeachment power is designed to resolve that. And those may involve criminal acts, although they may not involve criminal acts in particular circumstances. But you need a tool to address those political problems as they arise. And one feature of thinking about the kinds of high crimes and misdemeanors that arise that may call for the use of the impeachment power is it emphasizes to us that in order to think about impeachments, we also ought to be thinking about what other tools are available to us to try to address those political problems as they might arise, and to what degree is the impeachment power itself, if we were to use it, to actually going to be effective at addressing that underlying political problem. And those things are likely to be tied up together. And so we've heard earlier, for example, that one of the real concerns during the Nixon impeachment was if you're going to advance this, it needs to be bipartisan, precisely because what's the point of pursuing an impeachment that's not going to have bipartisan consequences? Because even if you can get it through the House, where you only need a simple majority, ultimately, in order to pass articles of impeachment, it's going to fall as a dead letter in the Senate, where ultimately you need some bipartisan support if you're going to be able to actually have a chance at getting a conviction going along. Which forces you, if you're at that very opening moments of the impeachment process, to be thinking about what are we trying to accomplish here? And how do we pursue this in a way that we're actually going to be successful in accomplishing those objectives down the road? And if the objective is ultimately to remove a sitting government official, especially a president of the United States, then that means we have to begin that process in a bipartisan way. We need to make those initial choices in a way that we can build the political support that's going to be necessary within Congress, and not necessarily in the nation as a whole, in order to think we're going to accomplish that core objective, which in this case means removing that government official, which ultimately means we have to be able to get bipartisan support in the Senate down the road. But there may be other circumstances where we imagine, look, we're not concerned with that. We don't necessarily think we're going to be able to remove that government official. We don't think it's ever going to be possible to win that political support. So removal is off the table as a starting point. We may think removal is not actually necessary in a particular case, which raises questions about should you be pursuing the impeachment path at all, if that's the calculation that you've made? And if you are going to be pursuing the impeachment path, what are you trying to accomplish by doing it? And I think there are things you can accomplish by using the impeachment tool, even if it doesn't lead to the removal of a government official in the first place. So we might imagine, for example, that impeachments are a way of accomplishing greater oversight so that you get more transparency and visibility into what mistakes have been made, for example, in the executive branch through the impeachment process than we might otherwise reveal. That part of what we heard earlier about the nature of the impeachment process as it was being played out in the Nixon situation was precisely the extent to which it was developing information, assembling that information, clarifying that information, verifying that information in order to publicize the abuses that had taken place. Now, ultimately, there's a particular objective that in that context that gathering information was designed to serve, which was to build the case for removing a sitting president of the United States. But you can also imagine that even if you don't think you're going to get the removal of the president of the United States at the end of that process, it nonetheless is worth accumulating and publicizing that information simply to reveal what has happened. relative to the abuses that have taken place within the executive branch and further that investigative process more generally. And the impeachment power may be the best tool available for accomplishing that. We might imagine the impeachment power being designed in order to emphasize norms that are being violated or norms that we need to establish about how we expect government officials to behave in their offices going forward. And part of what the impeachment power does is call our attention to things that we're going to characterize as abuses, which requires in part a discussion about what counts as an abuse of power in this context. One thing that came up in the earlier context was to what extent was Nixon doing something that was in fact unusual for mid-century presidents? And to what degree was he engaging in a set of activities that in fact some earlier presidents had engaged in to some degree or another already, that we had seen LBJ engage in, JFK had engaged in, other presidents before that. Part of what was happening during that Nixon process was also a conversation about how do we expect presidents to use their powers? What counts as an abuse of power for the presidents? What's appropriate behavior by a sitting president going forward, not just relative to the past? And the impeachment process becomes a vehicle for talking about those abuses, talking about the expectations of this particular office, and setting some expectations about norms, about how government officials ought to conduct themselves going forward, even if it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to remove this government official in this particular moment. But that also means we should think about what other tools might be available to try to accomplish those kinds of goals. And what we see in front of us is a particular kind of political problem. It may be that the only thing that can solve that problem is actually the removal of the sitting president or some other sitting official that we're going after in this context. Right? But you can imagine there might be other tools that are available that can help alleviate the political problem that's in front of you. You might imagine statutes can help alleviate that, and part of what emerges out of the Nixon process and the larger Watergate scandals is a rethinking of presidential powers and a set of statutes designed precisely in order to contain and reduce the powers of the presidency in order to make it less likely these kinds of abuses occur going forward. Impeachments might be a vehicle for helping that, but we might think the statutes can do that kind of work on their own. We might imagine other kinds of oversight mechanisms that can accomplish the same kinds of publicization of bad behavior by an officer that doesn't require the actual impeachment mechanism per se. We might imagine other kinds of activities in which the goal is how do we minimize the kinds of abuses that are in front of us? How do we minimize the bad behavior or the particular political problem that we see in front of us that may not require the impeachment power, or maybe the impeachment power is either going to be an inadequate tool for addressing those problems or may not be a very effective tool at addressing those problems down the road, and we'd be better off seeking a different kind of solution. And in some cases, seeking that better solution may in fact be what we really need to do is win the next election. And that will be more effective at accomplishing the goals we're trying to accomplish than actually pursuing the impeachment power as such. But all that requires thinking about this in a political fashion from the very beginning. We need to be thinking about what are the strategic objectives by which we're pursuing this particular constitutional tool. What are we trying to accomplish by going through this process? What decisions do we have to make then as we go through that process in order to make it most likely we're going to achieve those objectives down the road? And what other tools do we have available to us that may be as effective or maybe even more effective at addressing the problem that we have before us? Thank you.
Thank you all. I want to start by giving Philip a chance to respond to Jeff's remarks about his claim.
Hyperpolarization of Republicans. Well, I have to say that even if you believe that that's a pervasive problem, they could have done things differently. Trump had his Republican critics, some of whom voted for impeachment 2 times, and they were not centrally involved in the process of shaping those impeachments. They were very much on the outside and then happy to give their support to it. You could have brought in Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger and said, how do you think we should write this if we're trying to get the most Republican support we possibly can? That was very much not how they did things. When I think about the kind of public profile that Adam Schiff came to have compared to what we heard about Chairman Peter Rodino, it could hardly be a starker contrast. So I just think, and a brief word on Keith's last note, I think that an awful lot of contemporary impeachment efforts have just shifted into this mind frame of, oh, well, we're obviously not doing this because we think it's going to work. We're doing this because it's to embarrass our opponents as much as we can. So much of American politics today is about embarrassing our opponents as much as we possibly can. your mileage may vary. You may think that embarrassing the other guys really is the most important thing because they're that bad. But to me, that just seems like a very awful equilibrium that we're stuck in.
So I've got some questions, but any other remarks about what one another said? So just a few thoughts. I mean, the foundational way, that the most important thing to understand about the impeachment process, we've all alluded to this, is the two-thirds requirement on conviction. Almost always requires a supermajority, almost always requires members of the president's party. And that is a serious constraint on conviction. And in comparing the Watergate situation to today, the way political parties were organized, the way they related to one another was so completely different then. There was overlapping in the parties ideologically. Congress was viewed its interests institutionally much more seriously than today. Today we have what Levinson and Pildes call a regime of separation of parties, not powers. We have the parties splintered among one another like they've never been before. We have structural things that have developed, campaign finance, the way Congress is organized, et cetera, that makes the parties be intensely partisan, all of which makes it extremely unlikely, except in the most extreme circumstances, that in the current organization of parties, we're going to reach that two-thirds vote. And I think Keith is basically picking up on this and saying, so we need to think of other things that, so if we're not going to get convictions, and I think the second Trump impeachment was maybe the proof of that. Maybe impeachment itself without conviction can serve useful roles. It used to be, I think there was a mild norm that if you didn't think you could get the conviction, the House wouldn't go for impeachment. That norm is clearly gone. So am I right in thinking that the party structure is so different now that it's just not likely we're in the foreseeable future that we're going to see the two-thirds vote be reached? I mean, we can imagine some super extreme circumstances. And then the second question, to pick up on what is the implication of that? Keith proposed maybe that, as I understood him, that the impeachment process as opposed to the conviction process could serve other roles. It could serve public information roles. It could concern accountability by getting information out. I'm a little skeptical of that because everything is so deeply partisan that all of that information is kind of partisanized, to use a bad word. So those are just some thoughts, and I'm wondering if anyone has any reactions to those thoughts.
Well, I might start I think that's right, that the party structure is critically important to thinking about the success of any kind of impeachment effort at actually removing a sitting president. In some ways, that's always true, right? Always extraordinarily difficult to remove a sitting president as opposed to thinking about, for example, a district judge, who is the official that we've been most successful at impeaching and removing over time. And so the political difficulties are always going to be extraordinarily high when it comes to removing a sitting president. But I don't think we should necessarily assume as well that the existing party structure that we have at the moment will always be structured in the way it's structured right now. And one thing that was very different even at the time of the Nixon presidency, which was not that long ago in the scope of a country's history, is that parties were organized very differently, right? And so, including not only some of the things you mentioned, but I think significantly that the electoral fate of presidents and members of Congress were not as closely tied together as they are now, right? And I think one thing that makes it very difficult for sitting members of Congress to go after, or even if they're not aggressively going after, to even vote against a member of their own party, is the fact that their electoral fate is so closely tied with the president that all the electoral incentives are to rally around the president rather than stand apart from the president. And you can imagine that might not be true in the future, but it certainly is true right now.
So Keith's point, as I take it, is that impeachment hasn't worked as well as anticipated, but maybe there are all sorts of other tools that could be used to accomplish some of its purposes. I think we should reverse the lens a little bit on that. because, and Keith, in one of the recent impeachment inquiries, wrote a really good essay in the New York Times on this theme. Impeachment is actually part of a larger separation of powers design. So we sometimes wrongly think of separation of powers as representing three co-equal branches that have equal power. What's misleading about that is that the branches may be constitutionally co-equal in some sense, but they have different kinds of power at different times, so that the president is intended to be more powerful in some respects than the other institutions, for example, in crisis times and so forth. So what would it mean to be equal and coordinate if, for example, the president is more powerful at the outset of political disputes or political controversy? One answer to that would be that the Congress has to be more powerful retrospectively, after the fact. The ultimate retrospective power is the impeachment and conviction power. Now, the reason that that is important is in between the ultimate power and its day-to-day powers are a whole host of things that Congress can do and has done in the past, and some of which Keith was alluding to it could do more of now. It can pass legislation. It can have inquiries and oversight inquiries. It can have compel testimony. It can do all sorts of things, many of which are outlined in a recent great book by a Georgetown law professor, Josh Chaffetz, called Congress's Constitution. But those things that it can do, for example, compelling information from the executive branch when it doesn't want to give that information, are made powerful by the possibility of the ultimate tool of impeachment and conviction, which doesn't mean that it has to actually be used. It has to be possible to be used. So fortifying and making possible impeachment and conviction is actually, in my view, essential to the functioning of all the other sorts of things that Keith was alluding to. And therefore, the failure of the impeachment in the first and second Trump trials is a serious warning about a pathology in our constitutional order today that needs to be repaired. And that pathology is the need to reconnect the office holders with the duties of the offices they hold, as was discussed so articulately before by Senator Cohen and Tim Naftali.
Just a brief follow-up. I very much agree with what Jeff just said. And when you think about those other tools at their disposal, legislation, well, the president has a veto. To override the veto, you need the same 2/3 to get past that, which is almost unthinkable in a sort of high salience showdown as things stand today. Of course, things can reconfigure, but given how central loyalty to the president has become to what it means to be a partisan, it is troublesome. And power of the purse. Well, you know, we saw an interesting example of that in the Trump administration when Trump said, I want more money for the border wall. Congress didn't give it to him. He said, okay, I'll declare an emergency and reroute money, because there's all kinds of ways that we've written the power to do that into the powers of the executive branch. So it showed that even withholding funds was not sufficient to check the president, who really got a lot of what he wanted out of using those kinds of tools. So yeah, I'm sort of worried that, yes, theoretically Congress has a lot of other options, but where are the teeth coming ultimately? If the executive branch just decides to say, well, we don't much care what you think, we're going to go about our business anyway, the impeachment is the ultimate axe that they need to be able to swing, and I don't know what they have if they can't.
Okay, we have 9 minutes left, so we'll start taking questions from the audience. But wait for the mic, please.
I was young 50 years ago, but it's...
Could you identify yourself, please?
Here? Oh, what I want...
Go ahead.
Well, what I want to know is you talk about the partisanship. 50 years ago, we've had like 3 major networks for television news and so forth, and we seem to have had a split up in where people are getting their news from their favorite media source, whether it's Fox News or CNN, which reinforces their prejudices. And I want to know what role the splitting up of the press has had in changing the people's perceptions on, say, impeachment, for example. So if they listen to Fox News, they'd be against impeaching Trump, and if they listen to MSNBC, whatever, they'd be all, they only hear one side of the story, and talk radio has the same effect. I hope that makes sense.
So the question is about the changing natures of communication and the bubbling of communication and its impact on these issues. Anyone want to?
Well, I think it was suggested earlier, right? I mean, it makes it much tougher to crack these partisan commitments, and because it's people not only are receiving information from relatively partisan sources, but it's also reinforcing their own beliefs about the nature of what they're hearing and how they're assessing that information in general, and that's going to make it much harder to build any kind of larger consensus or pierce that partisan resistance to a defense of your own side on this front. And so I don't think it's impossible with that kind of fragmented, more partisan media environment, but it is going to make it much more difficult.
Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
The one word we haven't heard today is gerrymandering, in terms of why you have, I guess it's, I shouldn't use diversity today, but there's less diversity philosophically. So when Ronald Reagan, he preached the Big Tent, there was room for very conservatives, moderates, and even liberals in that. And we didn't have the kind of gerrymandering to the point where all you have to do is prove, and you're running for office, you're more extreme than your Republican candidate on the right, or more liberal than your candidate on the left. And that's what's happened to this country. We are now in the camps where the other party is seen as the enemy as such. I really like the talk about the impeachment process, because that's what I mentioned before about Goliath's sword. It's no longer Goliath's sword. And as we're using it, I don't want to use the word trivializing, but we're trivializing the process. Congress can get information. We had the Iran-Contra investigation in terms of, did the Reagan administration engage in an act that was contrary to the best interests of the country? There was no talk of impeachment at the time. No one suggested it. But there was a real fundamental issue that was involved that the White House had constructed through Colonel Ollie North and others, an off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, covert capability. That is antithetical to what we believe in terms of the appropriation process. So we had that hearing. President Reagan said, you know, I didn't intend for this. Yes, I transferred arms to the Iranians, but I thought I would get hostages out, et cetera. I had no idea that this was being created for a separate, and we believed him, we accepted that. And so there was a joint bipartisan investigation that was given great coverage, and we never even talked about impeachment, but we thought this is something that needed to be exposed. You cannot have a covert capability funded by the sale of weapons at an increased price. So there are many tools, and I think it's really bad for the country that we keep using the impeachment process. It doesn't deal with the gravity of the situation. The people are elected, they're a congressman, got 2 years. If they find out you've engaged in inappropriate conduct, you'll be removed, or you used to be removed. Today, if we diminish the significance of what that violation might be, and that's the reason I raised the issue. If I have the power to order a Navy SEAL to shoot a political opponent. I mean, is that not horrifying for us to, and yet it has become part of the colloquial conversation today. So the first question you would ask a Navy SEAL, if the president asked you to shoot someone, will you do it? Well, is it Taliban or is it a Democrat? So, I mean, we have become accustomed to looking at language in a way that we minimize the significance of what people are saying. So we want to get back to standards, and I think the impeachment process has to be up here as a very, very last resort and not as an investigative tool. Sorry, I started to get what's the question?
Other questions?
There's a hand up over there around the corner.
I want to first off start by thanking you all for being here. It has been very enlightening. My name is Kendall Yanti. I'm an intern at the Cohen Group this summer. And you all spoke about being bipartisan in impeachment efforts. With today's highly hyper-partisan political state, how does one be bipartisan when launching an impeachment inquiry and then bring it back to their constituents who are probably hyper-partisan and argue it in a way where they will understand the crimes and the gravity that the president committed at that time? In the case of the impeachment inquiry that happened after January 6th.
Well, I would say it takes some courage on the part of these representatives. We should appreciate the ones who stuck their necks out. So like Representative Peter Meyer of Michigan served one term, lost his primary almost certainly because of that vote that he cast as a matter of conscience. We should appreciate that kind of gesture, that kind of fidelity to what he took to be his duty. And we should remember that they're not all gone, right? Representative Dan Newhouse, not a household name, but there he is. He cast his vote and he's still there. So we should try to, I don't know if people think it's grasping for straws, but there is in fact a little bit of life there in the bipartisan interplay. The channels of communication between the parties are very, very poor today. And that frankly suits congressional leaders pretty well most of the time. They don't mind it. The members themselves need to do a better job understanding where their colleagues are at and how they can make common cause.
I would say one thing about the January 6th impeachment in particular in this regard is I think it's hard to have anticipated quite how January 6th was going to play out in politics in subsequent weeks. But things would have looked pretty different, I think, if Congress had organized itself right away on that day, for example, which I thought they should have done, enacted immediately. There was a lot of bipartisan hostility to what had happened, and you could have imagined forming more of a bipartisan consensus in Congress to take action if you'd acted on the 6th and 7th to take steps toward impeaching and removing the president rather than waiting for weeks. And we may have then thought that how you build bipartisan consensus and how that plays out would look rather different if you'd taken advantage of that little moment in time when there was sort of bipartisan outrage about what had occurred. Likewise, I think reaching for the impeachment tool immediately over the Ukrainian situation, for example, might have turned out to be a mistake. Maybe it would have been possible to build more bipartisan support for exposing that this was bad behavior on the part of the president if you'd done it through a non-impeachment mechanism, more like a bipartisan committee of the sort that Senator Cohen referenced relative to Iran-Contra, rather than having people digging in as a consequence of the stakes being so high about are you removing the president or not? And so as a consequence, now we have to rally around the president as opposed to can we just have a conversation about whether or not this was a good or bad way of engaging in foreign policy.
On Keith's point, adding to it, if you had started early like that, you would have also avoided the whole issue of him not being a sitting president anymore.
Absolutely.
Yeah, think of what a shining example it would be in the history books if we had President Mike Pence for a week. That would have been taught to school children for generations. The stakes were completely different once the trial was for the former president.
And I'll also say, and I'll close with this, if that counterfactual world had happened and Trump had, and the impeachment system had worked how it was supposed to work in that situation, in my view, and Trump had been barred from future office, then we probably wouldn't have seen the prosecution of Trump, which, whatever you think about it for January 6th, is deeply, whether it's justified or not, I think it's a close question on the law, has deeply unfortunate long-tail consequences for the country. And that in turn led to a rushed Supreme Court decision in Trump versus United States, which would have been much better off not having been decided. So it's an example of how failure of a constitutional structure in one corner of the Constitution can have very bad effects in other contexts. Thank you all very much.